So I'll start. First, thank you note for our sponsors. Without them, we could not have this event. So Acquia, Wonder Platform, Javali, All the Gold, Commerce Guys, 1x Internet, Loom Idea, Every is involved, Thunder, Amazi, and all the silver ones as well. So just a short note about myself. My name is Hernani. I've been involved in Drupal for around 10 years. My 10th anniversary will be this year. Majority of my career, I've worked as a technical architect, first in Acquia and now as a freelancer. You can find my social media addresses there. And this year also, I was also part of this organization for the Drupal Dev Days. So I hope that you guys are having an amazing time in Lisbon, in the venue, and outside the venue. So today I'm talking about the problem that sometimes doesn't worry developers too much. So typically for anyone delivering a website, either you are a developer, an architect, a project manager, that's typically what the life of a website is like. So you start with a specification, you do the design and the architecture, then there's a long development cycle, it goes to UAT, site goes live, you probably worry about it for a couple of weeks, months, and that's it, you move to the next project. So that's typically the way that you see the life of the website. So this part looks like years, the maintenance and the support looks like months. In reality, what the life of a website looks like for the ones that uses it and for the ones that actually pay for it is the reverse. So you have the project phase when the website is being built and they need to deal with the developers and the project managers and all that people, and then the site is live when it goes, if it's well done, probably stay live for 4 years, 5 years. That's typically normal until you get another update, one technology, new version, new framework, whatever, and it moves on. The problem in this long time is that typically there's a temptation to leave the websites on autopilot. So basically, like we launched the site, we invested a lot of money and efforts to build the website, and now from that moment, we don't want to worry too much about it. And also, the problem is that at this point, the maintenance of the website, the updating of the website, if you use a framework like Drupal, it requires resources. So you need developers to be developing those updates or applying those updates. You need different environments to make sure that things are working before you push it to production. You need a way of testing it. You need to have a deployment process that still works and someone that knows how to use it. And typically, there is the effort that you put through the whole process, it's low. So as a consequence, you have these kind of examples. So sites that are not maintained were built by agencies or internally or by friends, and they don't have maintenance. So when a security problem occurs, and they can occur in any framework, then those websites are exposed, and sites just get hacked. If you use a very popular framework like Drupal, then it's very common that exploits are available in hours, days, and then it's very easy to have your site targeted with some exploit. So why people don't update? Well, because it's not easy. Things can break when you update, and that typically happens when you have a framework that is maintained with different organic components. Drupal is used and configured by totally different types of users. So from the large organizations that have very complex workflows to deploy and to test and to build a site, to people that just use it in shared hosting, for instance. So it's not very easy to have a process that works for all of them. Typically when you update, you want to review what is happening before you launch that to production. You just don't want to build something and launch it to production. Like, we developers like to see what is going on, what has been the change. Am I safe that what is being pushed to production is okay in terms of functionality and in terms of security? And there's a typical security concern that the software should not update itself. there's also some concern that from the moment that you have something that updates your software, that something, that central point, also can become vulnerable. For instance, WordPress does this, and there is a famous use case published by someone that found a vulnerability on that central update server, and luckily it was well-intentioned, and it communicates everything that should have been done to automatic, and they were able to fix it before it was exploited. But if that wouldn't have been the case, 27% of the web could have been exploited with this system. Okay? And if you are interested in the use case, then you can find details on that link. All these also became a bit more complex with Drupal 8. In our new Brave world, we have more dependencies. We write less code, but we depend more from the code that was written by others. And so we have more components. They tend to change a bit more, and they can also have some security release associated, or we might also want to benefit from some new functionality introduced on new versions. So it's typically that they change over the minor versions. Core is also evolving faster. So in Drupal 7, you probably will not need to apply every 6 months a new minor version that could actually change a lot of things in your site. So that involves more work. At least every 6 months, we are spending more time making sure that we are on the last version. And if you don't do that, then it starts to be a bit more hard. It starts to be harder to apply security updates. If you are in Drupal 8.2, if you are in the Drupal 8.3, it's harder to apply those security updates. So, as you might know, Dries announced an initiative to start to solve this problem and start to having an initiative that could aim to solve this problem in core. And people start studying about what are the different alternatives that could be explored. And one of the first things that they did was to try to find what are the different use cases that we need to address in this problem. So Drupal is used by many people, completely different types of organization, completely different types of websites. And what they came up with was these 4 personas. So persona number 1 just deploys the site and ignores. The persona number 2 is the site owner that cares once a year. So once a year they go there, apart from the security updates, they update the site in a more drastic way. Number 3, they are diligent, but they are with simple needs. So they just update, typically in a week of a release, they update. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was about 40% of the Drupal gang that updated like that. 40. Yeah, okay. And then we have the sophisticated. So basically, there's some build process involved on maintaining that site, either a composer build, maybe some SaaS. There's a QA environment, there's a proper deployment process, and that goes to production, going through all the process. So, who are you? By hands, number 1, number 2, number 3, okay, number 4, of course, we are all number 4. We are all sophisticated, right? We all use Composer. We all have QA environments. We all have build processes. But we also are in Drupal dev days. So we are kind of hardcore developers. So that's what we would be expecting in an event like that. But in reality, we are not all sophisticated. If you look to Dries notes from Vienna, 60% of the Drupal users update their website by downloading modules from Drupal.org. 24% using Drush, and only 22% they use Composer. So when we think about how to solve this problem, we might think about these numbers as well. I don't know if they changed too much from, they have been increasing. So what are the options? First one is require a smaller number of updates and smaller updates. So then we don't ask for people every 6 months to go through a minor update that can actually contain a lot of things and become hard to test and become hard to maintain. The second option is we make the update process easier, so we don't care about what is changed, but we know that when we update, we don't break functionality, it doesn't involve a lot of human effort, and it's integrated with our normal development or deployment process. And no option, we have something ideal, which is automatic updates. So what's typically involved in an update? And here it really depends on what kind of persona you are. But typically what is involved when you are building software with a lot of dependencies like Drupal right now is you have a manifest where you define all your dependencies and versions of those dependencies. So you need to, anytime you want to update, you need to build it again. So either composer update or composer install. You review the changes on those builds. You deploy it to an environment. You test, ideally automatically, even if it's not always the case. And if everything goes well, you deploy it to production. And, very important, you communicate the way through. So you need to alert your end users that your website is going to be updated on day X. And you're going to ask probably you're going to ask your end users to test the site in QA on X-1 or X-2, something like that. So it's still a lot of work. Or maybe not, if you just are, if you don't have a very complex workflow, and maybe you don't have a QA environment, and maybe you don't have automatic tests, you probably just go and update the site directly live on production. And there are plenty of people that do that, unfortunately. So all these things, they get easier when you have something like this. When you have a CI pipeline, so basically the way that you deploy to the different environments and the way that you build, it's always the same, and it's consistent, and it's just there and it works. You have multiple environments, and they are very good copies of the different, very good copies of what you have in production. So QA doesn't differ too much. The data that you have in QA is easily replicated with what you have in production, and it's quite easy to just copy everything that you have from production to QA, apply your changes, test if everything is working, and then deploy. Automated tests exist, so if you have automatic tests, then your confidence is growing that things are working. You don't just go and do some smoke test that everything is working and find out some days later that a random page, a random feature on your website is not working anymore. When security updates are automatically detected, so as long as you know that, hey, my website has a vulnerability in model X or model Y, so if you have some process that alerts you for that, then things get a bit easier. And developers can review what is being deployed before changes are applied. So there's like a review process of what has been built from scratch. So one of the things I want to talk to you about is my personal experience with this. So on the last 6 months, I've maintained typically 4 websites, Drupal 8 websites. So 2 are hosted in Active Cloud, and 2 are hosted in self-hosting, but the idea behind them is typically the same. I have a CI pipeline. I maintain the code without dependencies in a certain branch. I update that code. The whole thing gets built. The whole thing gets deployed somewhere. I test it, and I'm happy, and I deploy to production. And typically, I've been using a few minutes to have the site updated in production. So yeah, one of the sites that I've been doing this, it's a site that I think everyone visited this week, which is Lisbon 2018.drupal-days.org. And you can see the site is actually open source. And we basically copied everything that the guys in Sevilla did last year, so we didn't have much effort to do it. And I definitely recommend that next year event does exactly the same. And any other camp events do exactly the same, because it's a very well maintained piece of code. So this is a very simple update process, and it's not fully automatic, but it's way easier than maintain the whole thing in different manual processes in the different steps. And actually, it wouldn't be that hard to fully automate it, but I can talk about that in the next slide. So typically what is involved, so all the code is maintained in the Git repository. If I need to change composer.json, I do. If I don't need to do it. I run composer install update on the CI pipeline. That creates a build artifact. So basically that's the final code that is going to be deployed in a certain environment or in production in the end. That's tested. I have a way to merge that code to production, and there can be different strategies. You can have a master branch and you just merge there, or you can use tags and you just create a tag that is your release tag and you deploy it to live. So here is the update strategy in more detail. So I have, in my Git repository, I have a dev branch, just has the composer JSON, it has all my custom code, and it has all the steps that I need in my CI pipeline to build it. Okay, so no contributed code there, and all the patches you can have them in composer JSON as well. So there's a commit against that branch, and that branch typically triggers a webhook in the CI pipeline, which basically builds. And builds basically means a composer install at that stage. So all the code is fetched from Drupal.org or from other packages repositories, and from that point you have a build artifact that you can deploy to an environment that's typically automatically deployed to staging. So for instance, in the Acquia example that we are using in this event, what we do is whatever is built in the dev branch is deployed automatically to staging. We go there, we test, everything is working, and we create a tag and we move that tag to production. Okay? So yeah, 10 minutes and I might have my website fully updated in production. And it could be, of course, more evolved, the process. I could do something like before doing the tests, I could actually pull a version of the production database to QA. There are plenty of other things that I could have done here as well. So in terms of what is automatic in the process, so yeah, the build is automated from the first commit, and the deployment in staging is automated from that build. The first initial step when you want to start the update process, that's not automated, but that wouldn't be that hard to automate in any case. It's just a question of having a way that you have a new model security available, which would actually use the same information that the updater model from core uses. So we could detect that, and from that moment we could actually start the build process. There's nothing that could avoid us to do that. And yeah, the testing of the approval of the code is ready to go to production is not automated, but it could actually be as well. Even if it is kind of debatable if you want to do that or not. It really depends on your coverage that you have on automatic tests and the effort that you want to put on testing the site here. Okay. So the same workflow that I'm doing here, there's actually some commercial products that actually do this as well. So one of them is Drupal, and the way that they do it is basically the same idea. There's a Git repository that contains your code. They have a way to detect which models you are using on your website, and they have several ways of doing that. But from the moment that they detect there is a model that is vulnerable, or you are using core and core is vulnerable, from that moment they start the update of your Git repository, and then you can define different strategies in what they call the different strategies to guarantee that that deployment or that new build can be either deployed to a certain environment. There is only a pull request that is created against a certain branch. There's plenty of options that you can do there, and that's really where things get complicated, because it really depends on the workflow that people want to have. And really depends on what type of complexity you have on the website and your teams to review that update. But yeah, they have the same problem. I don't have any experience with it, but we have someone in the room that is from Dropcard if there are questions about it. But the idea behind it is basically the same. So these are just some processes that we have that are not fully automated. And as I said, this is a problem that is recognized by Drupal leadership, and there's been some work that's been put in place to make sure that we can solve it, at least for some of the personas that we have on the previous slides. So how do others solve the same problems, right? We are not the only framework that has this problem, and one of our main alternatives, WordPress has supported automatic updates since October 2013. And they support it for not only for core, but for plugins, for themes and translations, even if by default only minor releases and translation files are updated automatically. And the way that it does, it's basically overwriting your code directly into disk, and it does it going through a central updater, so api.wordpress.org. In your cron of WordPress, it checks if there is something new to be fetched. If there is, then it fetches progressively, and when the new version is available, then it overwrites the whole thing. So it's far from perfect, and it's far to address all the personas that we have. So it's not great for many organizations. There are security implications around it. It's not adaptable to many of the hosting providers that people are using in Drupal, for instance, because typically they don't allow you to just write code in files directory, in the directory of where your web root is, but only on the files directory. So it's, even if it would cover a large percentage of websites that don't update in Drupal, so the lower ends of websites that we have that don't get very visibility and are not covered in maintenance by maintenance teams, it's typically not involved for us. And if you want to do something similar, and if you are not using Composer, we can actually do something similar with this command, like do a drush update code with security only. That would overwrite the code that you have in your web root, and actually you can even have a cron job doing the same. But it's far from addressing all the personas that we have, and it's far from addressing a world where we're going, where we have Composer behind the build process, and we have more and more sites that are in the higher end of the scope, and therefore typically in more complex workflows in different webheads. Some people do that. I know some. So, in Drupal, we probably need to do it in a different way. And Dries announced this concern as the main concern for Drupal adoption in the next years, and actually announced an initiative behind it. He named it Automatic Updates Initiative, and it was announced in Vienna. And disclaimer, I'm not involved in the initiative, so what I'm talking about is mostly by reading issue queues and seeing presentations that were provided about the subject in the last events. Okay, so if I say something wrong, feel free to correct me. But so from where we are right now, so there are different use cases, and the roadmap is still being discussed, and different options are still being discussed. There's different options in the table. But what is clear at this point is that to make this happen in Drupal in the right way, it is dependent on several other initiatives. One of them is making sure that Drupal core supports Composer in a better way that is done right now. So actually the initiative got divided in three different streams of work. So improve Drupal core relationship with Composer, the idea of the ABA vendor directory and bootloader concept that I'm going to explain soon, and the idea that the initiative about code signing and integrity. So basically to guarantee that when you are downloading new code from whatever central directory you have, that code is signed and it's trustable. Okay? So the best source that I found to get updated about the initiative was the core conversation in Nashville, where some of the concepts were discussed and some ideas got present. So one of the ideas that is currently right now being explored is the idea of the bootload concept. So basically, the idea is that instead of just having a vendor folder where all your code could live, we could have different vendor folders. So anytime that you update Drupal, you could actually create a new vendor folder with a different name, so like a random name like this. This is the previous version, this is the new version. And then what the update actually means is making sure that you are loading the right vendor version. Okay. However, this contains some tricky parts, like We know that core doesn't live there. We know that contrib doesn't live there. So to make sure that something like that could work, we need to guarantee that it goes to the right location before we can do something like that. And we also need to make sure that we have a way to guarantee that all the code that goes there is from a trustable directory, it's from a trustable source, and that after the process is finished, we are able to run whatever commands we need to make sure that it can be updated correctly, namely things like database updates. So yeah, the source from this idea, you can find it from this talk from Nashville from Peter Womanin and Dave Strauss. And also there is proof of concept, I think, created by Dave Strauss about a process to do this called PHP root, which is basically this concept of the AV folder, which can actually be used by Drupal, but by other frameworks as well, because the problem is actually the same for any framework based in Composer. Okay? That was everything that I had to talk to you today. So, questions? I think we have a microphone here.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if it was also in part of the scope of the initiative to handle rollback if something is going wrong in the process of updating.
So as far as I know, what is in scope for MVP or the first version is only security releases, and I don't think that rollback is on that scope. But it really depends on what the rollback means, right? Because if you are not updating your database, rolling back is just switching to the previous vendor folder. If you are doing a database update, things are way more complicated than that, and probably not in MVP. Yeah.
Maybe what about like this whole idea that we trigger PHP to run a file system and do a lot of stuff over there? Because that's a fundamental problem that you let PHP write stuff, which you shouldn't. From a security perspective, what I see there is that like this is all going this route, this initiative. They're not trying to do it somewhere else with a kind of daemon that is external from something, or like a kind of drush, Drupal console kind of stuff that is not, that runs not in the context of the web server itself.
I think all those details are still being explored, as far as I know. But you can Jess can probably know more about that.
I actually don't know too much about this initiative. I haven't had a chance to follow up since Nashville. But to answer the sort of like address the previous question about rollbacks, I think the strategy in that situation would be you want to back up of your database and then just switch back over to the previous vendor directory, as you said. In terms of the file system security and writing PHP to the file system, there's kind of two different options. So one is making sure that you actually keep it outside of your web root, right? And that would be the best option. And then for hosts where that's not a possibility, we would use the same sort of like security through obscurity that we use for the files files and configuration directories currently, where you have the big long thing. So I think those are the two options we discussed as of. I'm looking right now in the notes from the discussion. It was a follow-up in Nashville. I don't see it mentioned specifically, but that's what I recall anyway.
Just thinking it from a kind of Unix perspective, it's like even if you do the rollback, that's also just a bunch of files, or you take a dump from the database, and that also you write it on the file system. So that is also the rollback is quite involved in that as well. Because it's just about in which security context you're working in, and when you do it from PHP side, then yeah, where do you put it where you can still write it? That's kind of a tricky game to solve.
Yes, Sylvander.
It's more of a comment than a question here, but regarding whatever discussions happened, I wonder if the big sites factory case has been discussed, because upgrading one site, that's one thing. Upgrading thousands of sites, it's something different if they share the same code base. So yeah, it was just a comment on that. Anyone?
Shandip.
I didn't have a question, I just wanted Ricardo to come to the back. But no, in terms of everything you've read, Hanani, what do you think will be a realistic timeline for us to maybe see this?
I have no idea. I think more and more people are going to explore solutions that the one I'm using until we got proper support from core. But from what I can see from the issue queue and the discussions, we are still in very early days on solving this into core. Come on.
Yeah, in conversations like this, it's like almost like they're releasing product managers need their own mic. So in terms of the timeline for the initiative, what we're looking at, like Dries just blogged about the composer part of it, which is one of those 3 streams of work that Hanani mentioned. That some of the stakeholders from that initiative are here. So if you want to see this sooner than many years in the future, I would find them at the sprint here, indicate that you're interested in helping out, or at least like talk to them about what the ideas are. There's an opportunity here at Dev Days to actually work on that and learn more. There are a few things for the Composer Initiative, a few core issues that we have. They've just listed out that in a rainbow world might be committable to 8.6, but I think it's more likely they're going to 8.7 at this point. But there's like four core issues in terms of just functionality, things like core support for semantic version. There's this whole dependency chain with how we use Composer and like how core handles modules and everything that sort of like propagates down into this initiative. I would say that right now the people who've done a lot of like the research and technical brainstorming around it don't have paid time to work on it. So that's another opportunity to make it go faster. But the initiative is sort of, I would say that it has like the least momentum of our initiatives currently, but it's also probably one of the most important for Drupal's future. So if your company has resources to invest in this, could sponsor a developer, if you have like 20% time that you're interested in helping with it, if you have expertise in this area because you have like experience as a hosting provider or support, definitely would encourage you to get involved. I think that's all.
So anyone?
I would address the multi-site update question. I don't think there's anything going on in Drupal core to solve that. I don't think we've been making any changes to multi-site recently. Acquia built a very, very custom solution to this in Drupal Gardens/Site Factory. I think Peter Volanin was the mastermind of it, basically. So what Acquia does inside Drupal Gardens to update a lot of multi-sites is DNS tricks. So it sets up a different domain name for the site that it needs to be updated, and that gets a copy of the code base, and then the domain name is switched over to one by one, site by site. The domain name is switched over to the other code base. It runs the update on the other server that's now the new domain location, and then once all of it is done, then that's your new server. So one by one, it can run the updates on a different code base, even though it's a multi-site. But that's a trick. So I mean, that's not something that Drupal has control over to do, because it's like the whole infrastructure stack needs to be able to support that.
I think it's a similar approach that Agar uses as well. Something similar. Okay. No more questions. So, obrigado.